Oh, all right, I guess I'm just going to speak up since there's no microphone here on the podium. Welcome everybody to the 10:30 presentation, Propagation Best Practices from Commercial Scale Cultivation for Optimal Growth. If you would, please silence your cell phones. I am Shango, host of the Shaping Fire podcast. If you like listening to smart interviews with the top minds in cannabis, I invite you to check out the show at shapingfire.com. We also have an extraordinary YouTube channel with over 150 speaker videos I've recorded at events just like this one. Doug Jacobs, our speaker, is already on the channel and will be posting this presentation next week. Doug Jacobs is technical advisor with Grodan, providing expert consulting on proven precision growing methods. He has extensive experience with indoor, outdoor, and greenhouse hydroponics, vertical farms, aquaculture, and CEA system design. Today, Doug will be speaking about proven precision growing methods to optimize crop production using irrigation strategies and other operational factors to produce the best quality plants using the least amount of inputs. And he told me on the side, we're going to talk a lot about mothers today. So please put it together for Doug Jacobs.
Good morning. Thanks for the excellent introduction. My name is Doug Jacobs. I'm a technical advisor for Grodan. I started growing plants probably when I was like a baby with my parents. They grew orchids and tropicals in South Florida. You know, like a lot of people in this room, I probably got involved with cannabis early, around 14, 15 years old. Grew a little bit, sold a little bit, really was fascinated by the plant. Got out of it probably right before legalization, started doing urban farming, vegetable consulting, building urban hydroponic farms, greenhouses, got a lot of cool experiences out of that. And about 4 years ago, I started working for Grodan. Didn't think I was going to end up doing cannabis again, but happy to be here. Been spending the last 4 years helping to marry commercial vegetable production with cannabis production. So a little bit about Grodan. For 50 years, Grodan has been a leader in manufacturing hydroponic substrates for the commercial horticulture industry. With a focus on uniformity and sustainability, we've developed propagation blocks, plugs, slabs, loose substrates for tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, and obviously for cannabis. Our goal has been to help increase the sustainability of our farmers around the world, using less water, less nutrient, decreasing labor costs while increasing yield and quality. In addition to making growing media, we have developed tools like the Grodan GrowSense water content sensor that allows you to manage the water content and EC in the root zone in real time, giving you insights. This allows you to steer the plant growth, providing exactly what the plants need to grow, drastically reducing the amount of water and nutrient to grow those crops. And we're going to be building on this knowledge and experience over the next couple of years, increasing these tools and building substrates specific to cannabis to increase your sustainability and profitability. So today we're going to talk about uniformity. We're going to talk a lot about growing mother plants, taking cuttings, the veg phase, and a little bit about crop structures, primarily from the tomato industry and how they might be applied to cannabis. So uniformity in greenhouse and indoor farming is a fundamental requirement for making consistent and quality plants. The farm design and plant care plan should be developed with uniformity in mind. That is why modern greenhouses are tall, built to a large footprint, with no internal walls to create differences in environment, making a uniform climate for plant growth. Heating systems are designed to deliver heat and irrigation uniformly, and growers left the soil over 50 years ago to grow in Grodan because of improvements in sustainability and uniformity it provided. So, say 50 years ago, a tomato grower could get 10 kilograms per meter squared. Now we can get almost 100. Uniformity really starts with mother stock and propagation, because if you can repeatedly grow a batch of young plants and steer them correctly from the start, you can maximize production and growth. While all other subsequent inputs, labor, climate, irrigation, can be optimized, delivering the highest quality cannabis plants time after time. So sourcing mother stock, as you know, is probably the most important step to creating a uniform crop. Whether you're getting rooted cuttings, seeds, tissue culture, starts, you should take steps to ensure you're not bringing pest and disease into your grows. A test batch of plants should be created and run through a whole life cycle to determine how they perform in your facility. You should take notes on how these plants developed at every stage, how they react to pruning, climate, irrigation conditions, and climate conditions will help you move these plants into production. Other things, crop registration, which is not common in cannabis, should be taken on. We should find measurements that we need to take to see, hey, how is this crop developing? Is it developing differently from the last time I grew it, and why? Because if you're not taking these measurements, you'll never get any understanding on how the crop is developing. So like taking notes on root speed, quality of the roots, the plant height, stem diameter, leaf and stem color, node spacing, the natural structure of the plant. So taking an untopped plant, putting it into production, see how it develops on its own, and then making decisions on how to treat that plant later on. But before you can even grow your mother plants, you have to select a substrate type, determine how much volume is needed for each mother, an ideal planting density, all of which will define the irrigation system requirements. Cannabis mother plants are typically kept in large amounts of growing media, 5 to 25 gallons of substrate, and watered infrequently, usually 3 to 6 times per day, if they're lucky. This is a carryover from black and gray market days where you had limited space to commit to your mothers, plant count restrictions that limited the amount of plants you could have. So it's time to sort of relook at this way of growing mothers and see if there's a better way to get more consistency out of your crop. So having large mothers and large volumes of substrates has several drawbacks. First, it increases the risk of one bad mom spoiling a whole batch of cuttings. Taking large amounts of cuttings from a single plant all at once creates a lot of stress on the mother. Cannabis is a very resilient plant. You otherwise wouldn't know there's anything wrong with it just by looking at it most of the time. But taking, a third or a fourth of the plant off at one time does create a lot of stress and has a cascading effect on all your subsequent cuttings down the road. And then finally, a labor perspective. Large mothers sometimes require workers to get on ladders, work in strained positions that increase your liability as growers and owners. So it's time to look at maybe using a higher density of mothers, smaller mothers and smaller substrates that are more reactive, that you can steer. This decreases the threat that one mother would pose to a whole batch of cuttings. And using a smaller volume of substrates or growing media, especially something like Grodan with a lot of root space, would allow you to use irrigation as a tool to steer mother growth. So when I talk about crop steering, for those who haven't been to one of these presentations before, we're talking about the difference between vegetative and generative growth. So vegetative growth, simply put, I'm growing leaves and stems, focusing on building out the plant. Where generative growth is, I'm focused more on fruits and flowers. But I can use the steering for both regardless of what stage. So I can be generative in my mothers, I can be generative with my cuttings, I can be generative in veg, I can be generative in flower, I can be vegetative in all those stages. I think that's where the problem starts, is that a lot of growers start out generative, end up being vegetative, and end up hurting development. So a little more detail into this. So vegetative irrigation strategies have typically higher water contents. You have smaller decreases overnight in smaller drybacks, so decreasing water content and you do this by manipulating the start and stop times of irrigation. Irrigation frequency is typically higher, so think of aeroponic systems. The more times I can deliver irrigations to the plant without oversaturating the root zone, the faster I can get it to grow. ECs, having lower ECs allowing for easier uptake of water is more vegetative, and then having overall higher substrate temperatures is more vegetative. And then generative on the other side is lower and decreasing water contents, again being manipulated by the start and stop times of the irrigations of the day. Irrigation frequency, though we're typically delivering the same volumes. We're just taking away frequency and just delivering a bigger shot of irrigation. So, you know, and then when I want to be more vegetative, I have a smaller shot size, but overall, I'm just changing the way I'm applying the same amount of water. ECs, typically higher ECs in generative steering, and then substrate temperatures, you know, you're mimicking the natural seasonal change by decreasing the root zone temp. Like irrigation, climate has a significant effect on how the plants grow and can be used as a tool to steer growth. How does the lighting type and the environment affect later stage development of plants? You know, switching from fluorescence to HPS or from LEDs to HPS, you know, can cause a lot of problems. So you need to take note of these and really see, hey, if I'm going from a lower lighting source to a higher like radiation source, so going from LEDs to HPS, I don't necessarily want to match the intensities. I may want to go lower to prevent stress and, from changing these plants from cuttings to veg to flower. So how can you effectively steer mother plants back and forth to get better cuttings faster while at the same time managing growth so your mothers don't grow out of control? Even when taking your cuttings, you need to take note of the environmental conditions that you're taking the cuttings in. You know, having high light intensity, low humidity while taking the cuttings can affect the cutting quality. Same thing with the mothers. Do I want a very active mother under high light, high humidity, high temperatures when I'm taking the cuttings and then trying to stick them? No, I probably want to reduce my light intensities at the time I'm taking the cuttings. Your growers, your workers will appreciate this as well. So, as I mentioned before, the way cannabis mother plants are cultivated might need to be revisited. So we're going to talk briefly about the method of propagation for chrysanthemum flowers to see how it can be adopted and applied to cannabis. So chrysanthemum mother plants are typically grown at a very high density, 30 to 40 plants per square meter, 1.8 to 2.5 plants per square foot. So this is like sea of green style of growing. This allows high density of mothers to be grown that will give you typically straighter cuttings, more vigorous cuttings. The high density hedge also reduces the threat of one bad mom affecting a whole batch of cuttings. But how does this deliver uniformity? So when they're creating the chrysanthemum mothers, they typically pinch all the plants at the same number of leaf sets. So they use leaf sets as the determining factor of when to take the to pinch the first head. So after the mothers have been planted and grown for about 4 weeks until they hit 4 to 5 leaves tall, then the head and the leaf is pinched, creating a uniform crop structure across all the mothers. Here you see the pinch on the 5th leaf. So keeping the number of leaves and branches even across all the plants is key to keeping the growth rate the same. The low crop structure makes it easier for growers to harvest the cuttings and ensure you're taking only straight tops. So 15 to 17 days after the first pinch, the cuttings are taken. These are all straight tops and have the highest growth potential. So this first flush, you know, think of mushrooms, that first flush of mushrooms is usually the strongest. Then subsequent flushes of cuttings can be taken every week or two. During this process, you may end up with some taller plants that may need to be trimmed back between and before harvest. As you see here, and all the cuttings are taken in one day. So really, traditionally with chrysanthemums, they're grown in another country. They're cut, they're put in a refrigerator, and then they're shipped to the greenhouse, and then they're planted at once. So this is something some cannabis growers are starting to experiment with. It's taking the cuttings, putting them in a refrigerator, and then taking them out when they're ready to stick. So as you go through each subsequent flush, you'll need to maintain an equal number of leaves and branches between the mother plants to keep them growing at the same rate. To figure out how exactly this can be applied to cannabis with all the different cultivars that includes, we'll take some experimentation and crop registration and what the ideal number of leaves, the growth speed, and how many cuttings can be produced in what time frame. Once you've done this a few times with each cultivar, you can create an ideal crop structure, density, and develop a schedule for cutting specific to that variety. So maintenance of mother plants. Between each harvest of cuttings, the growers will then go through these plants almost daily to ensure that they're growing uniformly. Leaves are removed gradually, so they're not doing full strips of the plants because The leaves are not only solar panels, they're batteries. They hold water and they hold nutrients and they help keep the plant in balance. So if you start ripping off leaves excessively or all at once, it can throw the plants out of balance. Some plants will uptake water faster or slower than others. So it's something to be considerate of. So in chrysanthemums specifically, they keep these mothers for about 26 weeks because they see a significant decrease in cutting success rates after 26 weeks. But considering the success with cannabis, it might be even shorter. We've seen growers find that after 3 months of having a mother plant, the cutting success rate just takes a nosedive. Where they were getting 90, 80% success, they got down to 60, 50%. And they can't explain why. Well, that mother's been stressed out, it's been there too long, it's time to change it out. So to take the most uniform cuttings possible with the least amount of labor, chrysanthemum growers use this special tool here to help ensure all the cuttings are the same length. This plastic tool uses a flat surface with a sharp edge that not only supports the cutting as it's being taken, but also ensures all the cuttings are the exact same length with a uniform number of leaf sets without the need of additional labor. So only new growth head cuttings are taken, even though with cannabis you can take lower growth cuttings and still have a similar success rate. And some stem is left above the node to protect it so you can grow another cutting. So it's important to have a clear visual scale for the size cutting you wish to make. The chrysanthemum growers use this visual scale to group the cuttings together to maintain uniformity. So stem diameter is used to group the cuttings as thick, good, or thin. And by having this visual and measurable standard to group the cuttings together allows them to be placed in batches so they all can grow at the same rate. In addition to keeping the stem length diameter consistent between the cuttings, they also have to ensure that the cuttings have the same number of leaves. So if you're lucky enough to have space in your cloning room, you should create a tray spacing that does not require you to have to cut off too many leaves and leaf tips, which is a contributing factor to creating differences in growth rates. So, there's been some university studies in Canada that found that just taking the leaf tips reduces cutting success rate anywhere from like 71 to 50%. So, we take leaf tips off because we're trying to cram a lot of plants in one space, but if we leave more leaf tips on and technically more leaves and then find an ideal spacing, you'll probably get healthier cuttings. So that same study done by the University of Guelph found that cuttings with 3 leaves as opposed to 2 leaves had a 15% higher quality in rooting, which is pretty significant. So if you have that space and the luxury to spread out your cuttings and not do the typical 98, 72, or 50 plants per tray, you'll find that putting 20 to 25 plants in a tray will give you a better quality cut. So now that we have uniformity in moms and some uniformity in cuttings, we now have to place them into substrate and have a way to maintain the cuttings until the next stage of growth. First, if you have the luxury of space, you'll need to find a good density that allows you to grow these cuttings without being overcrowded in the tray. Substrate volume can be adjusted based on how long you intend to keep the cuttings in the nursery tray. So you can use a small amount of substrate and grow a very small cutting and have to transplant it very fast. But if you use a bigger volume, so if you're using a 2-inch propagation cube, you can probably accomplish a little bigger cutting. And if you have an irrigation system that allows you to water it more frequently without oversaturating the root zone, you could probably accomplish some of your veg in the cutting phase. So having a larger volume, so the timing and frequency used to irrigate cuttings has a tremendous effect on how the plants develop. So watering too early seems to be the biggest problem for most cannabis growers, especially in rockwool. Rockwool has a higher water holding capacity than most other substrates. So if you water it too much, too frequently, you'll have poor root development. So the idea after the first, you stick your cuttings in substrate, you let the growing media dry back. Typically you could use weights to determine when to water. And then when you go for that first irrigation, you don't want to submerge the cube again. You don't want to push out all that airspace because it's going to slow down plant development. So you may just want to tap the bottoms of the blocks. Just touch them, just to give some new nutrient and bring the water content back up a little bit, but not up to full capacity, because that will slow you down. And then watering too soon. So, just using your hand is not necessarily the best measure, especially if you're letting your laborers do it. So you may want to actually record the weights of the trays or the plugs and use that to determine when to water, especially for hard rooting varieties that just seem to take forever. So now that you have you selected substrate, you have a system for irrigation that automates your propagation. Now you have to wet up your substrate. So commercially, this is typically done with wetting lines. These are conveyor belt systems with three booms of water that slowly move the blocks across a system that wets up the blocks automatically. Most of us don't have access to this equipment, but depending on your scale, it may make sense to automate this process. The other option is a wetting cart. So same concept except more manual. I have 3 wetting booms. I'm moving the cart slowly over the blocks to allow the water to saturate the blocks. If I throw too much water too fast on the substrate, I could potentially just bypass the substrate in different parts. The water won't spread out and it'll just go down and out. So you really have to work on applying either water really slowly or fully submerge your blocks in plugs to get initial saturation. Once you initially saturate your substrate, you then have to check the weights. It's the only way you can determine if I've wet it up correctly and consistently across the batch. So using weights as a measurement to determine have I fully saturated my substrate and when to irrigate are probably the most important tools you could use as a grower. So again, weights of the plugs and trays and blocks should be checked after initial saturation to ensure that they've been saturated correctly. And it also helps you determine, hey, is there something different with either the way I've wetted up, or is the substrate holding more or less water? And then am I going to have to irrigate sooner or later? Otherwise, you're just assuming everything is correct and you're mindlessly applying irrigations without any consideration to what's going on in the root zone. So, as you probably know, climate has a significant effect on how cuttings develop. Often I see low lights in cutting rooms, so less than 70% or 70 micromoles, where in most other horticulture crops, 70 to 90 micromoles is what's used just to supplement natural sunlight in a greenhouse. So this low light intensity for cuttings potentially slows down plant growth. It opens up the plants to diseases. And extreme humidity with low light intensity can create, foliar diseases. So when you have plants in a humidity dome with low light intensities, potentially high heat from a heat mat or the heat from the lights below it, you're creating an environment to create molds. And I see a lot of problems where people who have big powdery mildew problems or other mildews and fungus, those typically start in propagation. So for example, when doing chrysanthemums, this is a chrysanthemum greenhouse in Holland, they do about 500,000 cuts per week. When they lay out the cuts, they lay out a plastic tarp just over top of all the cuttings. So you have a big volume of air that makes it consistent across the entire batch, but it's also keeping the moisture potentially away from the leaf tips. So if you notice, the cuttings that are at the end develop differently than the cuttings that are in the center. So we have to look at systems that allow us to raise the humidity without creating moisture on the canopy. So it's a revisiting of density in the cutting trays, but also trying to figure out ways to grow cuttings without domes. No commercial crop other than cannabis is uses domes. So to get the best cuttings possible, you should look at a system that maintains humidity between 70 and 90%. Growers should work to ensure that the leaf temps, the plant temps themselves are not getting too high. So using a infrared thermometer, going and checking, hey, is my root zone temperature high, or is the leaf temp high, especially when you're first placing those cuttings into the propagation room. So managing transitions from cuttings to the grow out stage is critical time. So where possible, you should work to adjust the climate of the cuttings gradually over the course of several days to match that of the environment you plan to transplant into. Failure to match the climates can cause a negative reaction that you will not notice immediately, causing shock to the plants and slowing down development and reducing quality. So if I go from my propagation room with 70 to 90 micromoles and a low temperature to my veg room with 200 to 300 micromoles, really high light intensity, high heat and no humidity, you can really mess up your crop and not know until weeks later. So it's really important to match those things or get the cuttings used to that environment prior to even putting them in the new substrate. Again, the same thing is transitioning from lighting types. So if I go from fluorescent to HPS or LED to HPS, I don't necessarily want to match the light intensities. I probably want to go lower on the HPS, or really just when you make that transition, you should probably make the new environment temperature lower, just to keep the plants a little more safe until they're ready to take off and to be rooted into the new substrate, and they can grow fast. As I talked about earlier, irrigation strategy is a critical tool in how the plants develop. Each irrigation applied sends a vegetative signal to the plant to grow. Think about how fast plants grow again in aeroponic systems. Since the roots are grown in air, the drybacks are faster, allowing for more frequent irrigation and drives growth and speed. If the goal is to develop the root zone, drybacks are important part of this process, especially when rooting into a new substrate volume. This is again where measurements by weight and sensors come into play to help you determine when to irrigate. If the roots are leaving the block, it's most likely because you're applying too much water, you're achieving too much drain, or you have water buildup in the table. If you're growing in substrate, you typically want to keep the roots in that substrate. If you're promoting root growth outside the blocks, you're opening yourselves up to more disease. So when I go to transplant, I have all these exposed roots in the bottom, I go to put it into something else, I'm going to damage these roots and potentially open it up to a virus or a pathogen. So an irrigation system is really the only way to get consistent and uniform resaturation and irrigation, even for cuttings and in veg. Irrigation systems like flood tables, NFT systems that use shallow trays with a small water stream going across it not only allows you to automate the irrigation process, but will help you maintain the uniformity you've worked so hard to create. So inconsistencies created by hand dipping trays, hand watering, will carry throughout the entire life cycle of the plant. Flood heights and dip times can be adjusted to apply just the amount of water to steer the plants as you see fit. Hand watering is possible during the grow phase, but it creates a lot of inconsistencies. So when selecting an irrigation system for veg or for cuttings, it's important to have a system that allows you to manipulate flood height. So I may want to flood high that first irrigation when I'm saturating substrate, maybe the second one, but later ones I may just want to apply very small, just touch the bottom of the blocks or the pot, so I'm not completely pushing out all the air from the growing media. So here's an example graph of initial dryback from a grow-down small block for a tomato crop. So the dryback happens slowly over the course of 4 days. So you're going from a water content of roughly 80% at initial saturation down to 30%. And then I'm giving it another big feed, and then I'm going down again. So this strategy creates roots, forces those feeder roots to come out and search and root into the new substrate. But after I've done that, then I can start using irrigation as a tool to steer growth. So once you've rooted into the new substrate, then you can apply the irrigation strategy. So for generative steering, you'll want to apply larger volumes of substrate, or larger volumes of irrigation with less frequency. So in an ebb and flow system, this can consist of flooding higher up the side of the block, less frequently. In drip, this can be accomplished by applying irrigation volumes of 6% of the total substrate size. So say I have 1 liter of growing media, I would give it a 6% shot, which would be 60 mils. The timing of these irrigations will dictate the dryback. So if you wish to be more generative, you can wait longer to apply the first irrigation of the day and you'll stop earlier in the day, several hours before the lights go off to have an increased dryback overnight. This should result in a smaller, more compact plant with a better root system inside the block. If you want to be more vegetative, if you want the plants to grow faster, then you will want to apply a more vegetative strategy. This is accomplished using smaller irrigations, each typically 3% or less than the volume of growing media. So again, a 1 liter block, I would be applying a 30 ml shot or less. In flood systems, you'd apply irrigations that would just touch the bottoms of the block, ½ inch or less. You will still want to ensure drybacks between irrigations of at least 1 to 2% if you have a sensor, a water content sensor that allows you to measure those, and drybacks overnight of 10 to 15%. So this would mean you might end up watering earlier in the day, all the way throughout the day, so the plants can uptake water. But usually you need to wait for the plants to start to drink before you irrigate. So you do want to delay. You don't want the lights to come on and immediately start applying water, because this will slow down growth. So it's called transpiration before irrigation. So once you're able to see that the plants are uptaking water, either just by looking at it, or you have a sensor, then you can start applying those first irrigations of the day. This type of irrigation strategy will result in healthy, vigorous, fast-growing plants, and just get you a faster veg. So how does this work in practice? This chart shows how to apply vegetative and generative irrigation strategy to grow down small blocks. So while the maximum wet weight, the peak water content, stays the same, the dry weight is almost 100 grams less for generative steering. The rest time between irrigations is used to steer the plants, with long rest times between irrigations for more vegetative growth, while shorter rest periods steer the plants more vegetative. ECs of the applied irrigation solutions are adjusted and used to steer growth. So higher ECs creating a more generative steer, while lower ECs more vegetative. Climate is also used in conjunction with irrigation to steer the crop, and is just as important as the irrigation strategy. We're almost there. So finally, the structures of the plants have a profound effect on uniform development. Plants with different numbers of leaves and branches will uptake water at different rates. I get this complaint from growers all the time. It's like, I have some plants that are really wet, some plants are really dry. Some of that's the placement within the room, how much light they're getting, but a lot of it has to do with that crop structure. Are they even between the batch? So having different number of leaves and branches, it affects this uptake rate. Excessive leaf removal and pinching can create uptake inconsistencies in the days following their application. So when you do go through and you do remove leaves, you probably have to make an adjustment to your irrigation strategy in the days following those leaf removals. Otherwise, you're going to either overwater or underwater the plants. What's pictured here is provided by a seed company selling high-wire cucumbers. Specifically, this chart here defines how the plants should be deleafed in relation to fruit and flower development. So as the fruit is removed, a leaf is removed to keep the plants growing all at the same rate and in balance. So if I'm talking about a 16-hectare cucumber farm, I want all those plants to grow at the same rate. I have to organize my labor, I have to plan for my harvest, so all my plants have to be exactly the same. So in my opinion, heavy deleafing and pinching of cannabis creates a lot of inconsistencies in the way the plants grow. I'm not saying don't remove your leaves. 5 minutes. Oh, shoot. I'm just saying you should look at different ways of removing them and maybe keeping it more in balance, whereas opposed to doing all those deleafings in 1 day or in 2 days, I'm doing it over the course of several days. This keeps the plants healthy and vigorous. It also keeps your labor a little more happy, because by the end of the row, they're probably just on autopilot, just stripping leaves, and it can cause damage to the crops. So only through time and testing will we one day be able to have pruning strategies like the chart here for cannabis. So very quickly, to demonstrate just how significant the pinching process can be on plant development, I just will discuss some pinching techniques for tomato. So the single-headed tomato plant, this is an untopped plant. You know, it's very strong. It grows very fast. You know, it's not typically done because it requires a lot of climate steering to keep the plants from growing too tall too fast. But I think this may be a good structure for cannabis plants. Is, you know, instead of pinching early, we pinch later. You know, using pinching as a height control method. But what needs to happen is we need to figure out the exact timing of when to space and veg. So a lot of reasons we pinch in cannabis is because we had limited space for our mothers, limited space for cuttings, limited space for veg. So we weren't able to transplant and space the veg plants on time. So you had to pinch to create the side branching. But if you have more space, and I can say, I'm going to space my plants 1 week after transplant, then I could probably build out the side and lower branchings better than taking off the head. So the other one is the pinch plant on the second leaf set. So this is the most common one for tomatoes. The second leaf set of the plant is, the head and the second leaf is pulled off about 4 to 5 days after transplanting out of cutting. This plant type is ready to transplant about 55 days after you've taken the cut. So they use climate and irrigation to control the height of this plant. So usually you are keeping the day and night temps even. So you're actually manipulating day and night difference. So the bigger difference between day and night, the more stretch I get. So if I want a less stretchy plant, I can keep the temperatures even. This also helps with humidity control. So instead of dropping the temperatures and then creating dew point, I can keep the temperature even, have a higher humidity and nighttime temperature, which really helps for climate control. And then finally, pinched on the first set of true leaves. This is for primarily seeds. I would not necessarily recommend this for cannabis, but it's an interesting crop to pinch it. Now you have two-headed plant. They're all growing at the exact same rate, and now I have a lot of control. The chart here sort of shows this when to apply everything. So you should develop charts like this. When do I do my first pinch? When do I space the plants in veg? And then what kind of climate and irrigation strategies do I need to use to control the plant height and keep plants even? So in closing, uniformity starts with mothers, cuttings, and in the veg phase. Consistent initial saturation, irrigation, and climate help maintain that uniformity. Planting densities for mothers, cuttings, and the later growth stages need to be optimized to build the most uniform crop structures possible with the least amount of labor and energy. Climate and irrigation steering should be applied and used at every stage of growth, from mothers, cuttings, veg, and throughout the flowering cycle. And lastly, pruning has a powerful effect on how the plants develop and is a primary tool for maintaining uniformity. Yeah.
All right, great. So we've got about 5 minutes for a couple questions. If you've got a question, put your hand up. While I'm getting to you, I've got one for you there, Doug. So you were saying that the study said that having more leaves when you do your cutting is going to actually end up being beneficial for the plant. Is there a high end of that where the plant that we're pulling is too big and it's going to put too much pressure on the root formation?
They only tested 3 and 4 leaf sets. They did not test bigger plants, but that's something interesting, and I hope to look at that this year. I have taken longer cuttings. I'm sure people here have taken longer cuttings as well. So I think it's something to explore. What is the ideal cannabis cutting length? I don't think anyone's really defined that. We have everybody doing different things. So until people have the scientific data or have done the trials themselves, and it probably will vary by the variety of cannabis.
Here we go.
How many studies have been done on the diameter of the cutting?
On the stem diameter? No, nothing's been done yet on the stem diameter. No, I haven't seen that. So. But I think it would make a difference, obviously, where it comes from the plant. They did study where it came from the plant, like whether top cuttings or bottom cuttings were better, and they found that there was really no difference between the top and the bottom.
So I had a question. If you were able to go to the prior picture with the tomato, I've seen a technique done with tomatoes, and I wasn't sure if we could do it with cannabis. When the plant gets a little bit bigger, actually that one picture you just had up,
This one?
The next one. Yeah, those bottom leaves are removed.
Right.
And then those are planted down into the medium to create more fruiting. Do you think cannabis could
I think you can do this. I think this is, for me, this is really would make weaker cannabis plants. I know it makes weaker tomato plants, so overall these plants are more weak, and this is not that one that's used anymore. And I've seen it done on cannabis, I don't think it's the right way. I think it's either untopped or a late top plant, so it's like, because most people are using topping as a method for creating side branches, but also for height control, because if I let the plant grow untopped, it's going to be a massive plant. So it's a question, do I top in veg, or do I top first week flower, second week flower, or do I top at a height? So I think that's something that needs to be explored.
How long can you use mothers for before you have to flip them to flower?
I mean, people have been keeping mothers for years. But it seems like after 3 to 4 months, the success rates of the cuttings declines rapidly. I mean, I think we really don't know what diseases and viruses affect cannabis, and because it's such a resilient plant, it's resistant to so much that you wouldn't know that there's something wrong with it, outwardly by looking at it.
So I guess, we do have one more.
So you mentioned not using domes. Do you just use different rooms with different lighting and humidity to adjust them, or how do you go about doing that?
Humidity tents. So I mean, it depends on what your grow room setup is. It's hard. It's hard because we've all designed our rooms around domes and trays. In the Chrysanthemum farms, they have a tray that has a built-in kind of structure that would support a tarp. So do I make a mini hoop over top of, because you can't put it over top of your rack, because now you're capturing all that heat and you're gonna melt your cuttings. So you have to figure out a way to insulate the trays from possibly the lights below, and then maybe just a mini plastic hoop over top, just to keep the moisture away from the leaf tips.
The last question here, Doug. When is it too late to take our tops anymore, because we've moved too far into the flowering process and the hormones are starting to gather at the top to form flowers, and if we actually take the cutting at that point, we will actually be impeding future flower?
You're talking about taking cuttings or when to top?
If someone's trying to do this for height control, actually.
Right. That's a good question. I don't know, and I think it depends on the variety, because some varieties will stretch a lot more than others. So I think that it's a variety-dependent thing. I think that's why crop registration is important, because I don't think we've so far seemed to be applying the same strategy to all cannabis plants, but they're all different. They're all significantly different in terms of height development and stretching and how they, So I think it's specific to variety.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Right on. Let's put our hands together for Doug Jacobs. Thank you, Doug.